So was the Pirate Party explicitly Georgist? You mentioned Georgism, or the philosophy of the American economist Henry George from the 19th century. And I mean, you're probably better placed to explain what his philosophy was, but I guess he was in favour of taxing land, wasn't he? He talked a lot about the unearned rent from land. Is that right?
That is correct. Now, of our policy platform, if you look at it, we do say, look, land value taxation is a good thing. It would be good to sort of re-emphasise our tax system to do that. And like when you have the universal basic income, I guess there's lots of people who'll chuck moral rocks at it. But one of the things we do try to do is say, look, how do we actually cost this in such a way we don't need print money to actually give people this basic income? And okay, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but you know, one of the principles is once you give people that basic income without constraints, we reasonably expect a lot of people will just work a few hours a week because they don't fall off a cliff and lose all their benefits. So you immediately sort of enable that initiative. But getting back to Henry George, yes, let's just say, I suppose, one way of capturing this this duality is that if you have a property and the government does something that lowers the value of your land, you wouldn't believe, you know, the hue and cry, the number of letters to the editor, you know, whinges to the local member. But let's assume the government sets up a rail station, not so close that it's polluting noise and making life inconvenient, but actually makes life very convenient for you. And the value of your land just shoots upwards. And I have yet to see a queue of guilt-ridden people at the tax office saying, wow, you've increased the property of my land enormously. I've got to give you some of that money back.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of capturing what Georgism is about. Now, the speculators will say, oh, by buying and selling land, we sort of contribute to the proper operation of the economy and society and so on. And okay, that's its own rabbit hole. And I broadly speaking, say that to the extent that's true, people are getting overly remunerated for that. But yeah, the thing is, land is in scarce supply. And, you know, if you actually tax land, it's a much better way of doing things. Let's say, going off on a bit of a tangent, but I think whether you want to have a right-wing or left-wing inclination, you know, everyone says you should get rid of payroll tax, and yet there was this idea with deal with GST where supposedly the tax states were going to get rid of payroll tax, and it didn't happen. But the point is, if you actually tax on land, on the one hand, it's fairer, and on the other hand, it's actually progressive in its way, because if you're wealthy, you're more likely to own land. But the other thing is, as society changes and business can be conducted here or overseas and people can telecommute and so on, taxing labour when labour is so mobile, you know, I think it makes more sense to say, here's a business, the business is set up in this location and we tax it based on the operation there. But yeah, the idea of the unearned increment, I mean, that is one of the things with a lot of economic perspectives. I guess we all draw the difference between genuine work that yields an income and basically just sitting back and raking it in. And that's, I guess, a moral distinction. And I think, you know, most, when they're a hybrid of economic and other perspectives, they demarcate the good economic effort from the dodgy economic effort. And we are sort of, we do actually celebrate innovation, not Silicon Valley style innovation, but like you sort of say, hey, you know, there could be a greengrocer here, maybe I should set up a greengrocer. That's being creative, and that's what we consider to be the real worthwhile creativity of economics. But sitting back and speculating, we don't see that as being so useful, and we think there's an over-return for it. So bringing it back to Georgism, taxing land makes a lot of sense. And of course, the word tax has, you know, all these negative connotations. Some people get neurotic about tax. You could say the charge on land is paying for the privilege that you have that monopoly. And I guess I'm going off, you're prompting me with other tangents, but if you're aware, there's some Georgists in Melbourne that actually did some analysis of apartment blocks based on the water usage. And they figured out that a lot of these apartment blocks were actually owned, but vacant and unused. And, you know, what And I know I've actually heard some commentators on your program talking about supply and demand of housing.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, in a limited sort of way, I do actually endorse the idea of supply being a factor. But what we identify is that people are doing land banking rather than actually either living at that property themselves or renting it or otherwise putting it into the market. And the incentives we have are such that it makes sense to you to just sit on property. But widening it out, we sort of say if the economy was more based on actual innovation and real economic activity, then people would have, shall we say, the non-speculative part of the economy would be stronger, land would be easier to afford, and it's a win-win situation. Basically accommodation is cheaper, but the non-land, non-speculative part of the economy is also more dynamic and stronger. So, I think that story of the railway station sitting up next to your place and the value shoots through the roof and, everyone just swallows up that and just sort of, oh, this is lovely. I think that captures a lot of what Georgism is about, the idea that maybe there's some speculation, maybe there's some useful speculation that lubricates the economy, but really a lot of it is people, I guess, having unearned income, and that's ethically problematic. But yeah, the Georgist perspective does actually fix that. Now, I emphasise the Pirate Party is informed by Georgism. We emphasise land value taxation, but if you look at our policies, our economic policies, everything, it is a part of what we're about.
Yeah. I think, did he advocate for a single tax on land? Was that correct?
That is correct. I don't think we would go so far as to say a single tax on land. We are believing in this negative income tax, and we also believe in fiddling around with the other parts of the tax system in order that guaranteed minimum income and negative tax, that package can be sustainable, and you can basically give people who earn no income a moderate amount of money without breaking the bank, so to speak. And part of the picture to sort of beef up our tax intake would be land value taxation. But equally, as I say, as our economy changes, as our global economy changes, I think it will actually make less sense to emphasise income as a source of taxation.
Just on the, you mentioned the rail line and boosting property values. You may have seen it already, but there was a good study that was done by a fellow Queenslander who's attached to University of Sydney, Cameron Murray. I don't know if you saw Cameron's study of the Gold Coast Light Rail, and he estimated some percentage value uplift for land within several hundred metres of the Gold Coast Light Rail. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I don't know if you've seen that, but you may be interested in that study.
Well, I haven't seen that, but I will sort of stick my oar in and say we have actually had Cameron Murray in on a more general discussion of housing within the auspices of the Pirate Party. And Cameron Murray has also written that book, Game of Mates, which I've had a read of. And that Game of Mates book, I think that one of the origins of that was actually a paper where he was talking about how there are all these increases in land value, and surprise, surprise, it seemed like the recipients of those improvements were often relatives or in some way related to people at council. And I guess, let's say we don't want to point fingers at anyone in particular or name anyone, but call that grey corruption. And his sort of thing that he was talking about was a taxation of the uplift. So if you have a zone change and that increases the value of your property, then that improvement is taxed. I think it's called a betterment tax was what it was called originally. And that's one of the things that Cameron Murray is talking about. Now, obviously, a zoning change is obviously a windfall in its own way. And I've sort of, I guess my story I started with was the railway station within moderate proximity to you. And that's not really a zoning change, apart from, I guess, the fact that maybe they had to change the zoning in order to have a rail line there and a station there or whatever. But yeah, there's different ways of increasing your property value. And one of them is, the railway station. Another one is actually the shopping centre nearby, or the swimming pool or whatever. And, one argument is that if you're just living there, and the world just changes around you and it was your choice to live there and that's a bonus, well, fair enough. But if in a sense you're buying and selling and you're actively in the market and someone else does something and you get the financial benefit from that, you can wonder how fair that is. But, you know, one of the things about economics, there's all this hand-wringing about what's fair and unfair, and I recognise that's part of the picture.